read a book recently, and it's called Cheap Clothes and Nasty by Charles Kingsley, and he's also known as Parson Lot. When he publishes books, he uses the name Parson Lot a lot. And this book was it was published in 1850, and it's about sweatshops and the clothing trade in Great Britain during that time. And it's a really interesting book, and I can see a lot of similarities on what's happening today with fast fashion and the fashion industry. Fast fashion sweatshops in Vietnam, Bangladesh, China. But back then, it was all happening in England, the unfair treatment and unfair wages of workers. So some quotes, there's some good quotes from the book. This one refers to the garment workers speaking about their experiences in the slop shops, they call them. They were altogether unanimous in their descriptions of the misery and slavery which they endured. It appears that there are two distinct tailor trades, the honourable trade, now almost confined to the West End and rapidly dying out there, and the dishonourable trade of the show shops and slop shops, the plate glass palaces where gents, and alas, those who would be indignant at that name, buy their cheap and nasty clothes. There's another good quote. At the Honourable Shops, the work is done as it was universally 30 years ago. 30 years ago, they're talking about 1820 then. On the premises and at good wages. In the dishonourable trade, the work is taken home by the men to be done at the very lowest possible prices, which decrease year by year, almost month by month. And they go on to talk about how the dishonourable shops are rapidly outnumbering the honourable shops and basically taking away all the business of the honourable shops. Therefore, the honourable shops having no choice but to close. In this next quote, they're talking about the dishonourable shops, saying, the greater part of the work, if not the whole, is let out to contractors or middlemen, sweaters, as their victims significantly call them, who, in their turn, let it out again, sometimes to the workmen, sometimes to fresh middlemen, so that out of the price paid for labor on each article, not only the workmen, but the sweater, and perhaps the sweater's sweater, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, have to draw their profit. And when the labor price has already been beaten down to the lowest possible, how much remains for the workmen after all these deductions? So this is basically what we call today like a subcontracting. So contracting out to basically like what factories do today is they can subcontract out to other factories. So a factory can receive an order. Maybe they're too busy or they're not able to complete this order. So then they'll find another factory and be like, hey, can you do this order? And that second factory will do it for a cheaper price so that original factory still makes some money off of that order, even though they don't actually produce that order. So by the time the work was subcontracted down to the fifth or the sixth person, they barely, or if at all, received living wages for the work that they did. And what's worse is that factory workers, they were idle about half the time that they were in the factories. Factories would just keep them around just in case a big order came in and they wanted to fill it immediately. And it didn't make a big difference to the factories because the workers were paid what's called piecework. They were paid by how many pieces they complete, whereas the honourable shops normally worked with paid their workers day work, meaning they were paid by the day when they were present in the shop. So not only did it not cost the factories any more money to keep these guys sitting doing nothing because they didn't pay them, not only that, but they actually made money off of these guys because the factories would provide the food. And so the more often that the men were just there, it would mean that they would have to buy their food from the factory. So they could not be working at all, not making any money, but they would still have to buy their food from the factory if they were sitting there. So the factory would still make money even when the workers were not working and were sitting there idle. But then if the workers would leave, if they wanted to leave when there was no work, they were not told ahead of time when work would come in. So if they left, they might miss a big order and a big amount of work, which would mean they wouldn't get paid if they missed it. So they mostly sat around in the workshop waiting for work to come in. And so, like I said before, workers, not only did they have to pay for their food, they also had to pay for their lodging, which both the food and the lodging was provided by the factory. And this is how they would sometimes be in debt to the factory. If they didn't have enough work that week, but they still had to pay for their lodging that week, and they still had to pay for their food that week, they could actually be in debt to the factory, meaning they had to pay the factory more money than they actually received for the work. To overcome this situation, the author recommends some things to do, which is really similar to today, which is things like just don't patron these kinds of places that you know are not treating workers fairly. Don't work at them. So people like me, designers or workers, try not to work at these kinds of places and try to find other places where you could make money. And he suggests to the workers that they should sort of open their own shop and compete against the slop shops. He also suggests for that the workers, the honorable trade shops, and like the landlords should all sort of come together and compete against the slop shops and sell high quality, fair waged clothing. The author also suggests for the workers to organize an association, which today is basically like a labor union. So I am going to put the link down below in the description for the book. It's on Google Books. It's only about 35 pages. It's a quick read, and it's free. And it's just interesting to see that some of the issues that we have today in the fashion industry existed over 150 years ago, just in a different country.